People in the commentariat on television and radio are making you stupid. And it is my job, it is my goal, it is my passion to make you smart. While keeping you company wherever you are, I want to make you smart if I can. We need to talk about Tim Walz's statement last night. He insisted you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Tim Walz last night took the most radical position ever stated by a presidential or vice presidential candidate on the First Amendment, essentially taking a very restrictionist position on the First Amendment, one we have not had in this country since World War I, that there is no basis under the First Amendment for hate speech or misinformation. There actually is. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that hate speech is protected speech. But Walz goes back to this line, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You need to understand where it comes from and why it's such a stupid thing to say. It was never actually law uttered by the Supreme Court. Let me give you the background here. In 1918, in Walzer versus the United States, South Dakota farmers had threatened politicians in South Dakota saying, we will beat you at the polls if you support a draft. Why? Because the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson's administration, had agreed to keep Americans out of World War I. The situation began to change, and shortly after Wilson's reelection, I think it was 1916, if I remember the timeline right, but it was 1916, 1917, the end of World War I, the Americans begin to enter, and Woodrow Wilson orders a draft. Americans, particularly of German descent, were outraged that the Americans would take a side in World War I. There was really no need to take a side. The war was beginning to wind down, but Woodrow Wilson decided it was America's time on the stage, and he was going to do it. So Wilson ordered a draft and then amended the Espionage Act of the United States to prohibit anyone from arguing against the draft. It was a breach of free speech. But Wilson prosecuted anyone and everyone who dared to question him. Woodrow Wilson was all of the things Democrats say they hate about Donald Trump in a person who really used the powers of the presidency to advance racism and dictatorship. He rounded up people who criticized him. He funded a brigade of brown shirts who would go around the country harassing and beating up anyone who criticized him. He would arrest people for speaking out against him. He would do all the things the Democrats say Donald Trump would do, but Wilson was a Democrat, so they give him a pass. His heart was in the right place, you know. So in Walzer versus United States, the South Dakota farmers say they're gonna challenge any politician who supports the draft at the polls. Woodrow Wilson has them all arrested. They are prosecuted and they are convicted, and their case goes to the United States Supreme Court in 1918, Walzer versus United States. And the majority of the court, we know from the record, agreed that they should be convicted. But one man, Oliver Wendell Holmes, was outraged that the idea that anyone would say we're going to beat you at the polls was somehow was a crime, was too outrageous for him, and he drafted a blistering dissent. It was such a blistering dissent that the Chief Justice of the United States at the time set the case aside, and the Wilson administration decided to abandon the convictions and prosecutions of the farmers. While all of that was going on, a man named Charles Schenck was in the United States in 1917 actively discouraging men from the draft. He was a socialist and a pacifist and opposed to the war. And Schenck was insisting that men should oppose the draft, not sign up for the draft, tear up the paperwork, not do it. He and his cohorts were arrested. They were not arrested for violating speech. They were arrested under the Espionage Act. And in 1919, the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was a crime under the Espionage Act to speak out against the draft. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the unanimous decision. And in that decision, uttered a phrase that is to this day uttered by people who have no idea what they're talking about. He wrote, The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree. You will note a couple of things. One, it's not shouted fire in a crowded theater. That's not actually the phrase. It is falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. But that was dicta. Dicta is an authoritative statement of an opinion, but it's not binding. It's not in the law. Schenck went to jail, though. Shortly thereafter, free speech advocates started denouncing Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a man of great ego, cared about his ego, and began to listen to the free speech advocates. And then 2 years later, wrote a dissent in Abrams versus the United States, a similarly situated case, where he said, actually people should have the right to speak out against government policies they disagree with. And that ultimately led to the Supreme Court beginning to change its mind. And in 1969, the United States Supreme Court issued Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969. The court held the government cannot punish inflammatory speech unless the speech is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. It was striking down an Ohio criminal statute because the statute prohibited the advocacy of violence. In other words, what the Supreme Court was saying is that it is acceptable to advocate violence. Brandenburg was a Ku Klux Klan leader in Ohio. He contacted a reporter at a Cincinnati television station and invited him to cover a Klan rally in Hamilton County in 1964. One of the speeches made references to the possibility of revenge against blacks, except they used the N-word, Jews, and those who supported them, and claimed the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court continue to suppress the white Caucasian race. Another speech advocated for the expulsion of blacks to Africa and Jews to Israel. He was arrested and charged with advocating violence. And the Supreme Court said, Mr. Brandenburg, Clarence Brandenburg, is perfectly allowed to advocate for violence so long as he doesn't commit it. In other words, he could yell fire in the theater. In fact, today, I don't encourage you to do this. You can go to your local theater and you can yell fire, and it's perfectly legal for you to do this. However, if you go into a theater full of people and you yell fire and it incites a riot and people storm out, you're not going to be charged with yelling fire in a theater. You're going to be charged with provoking a riot. You're going to be charged with provoking mass chaos. You're going to be charged with that. That has nothing to do with your speech. But people use you can't yell fire in a crowded theater in a way to say that your speech can be restricted. No, you are perfectly allowed to yell fire. In fact, you can right now, wherever you are, if you're by yourself, yell fire and you're not going to jail. You can walk down the hallway of your office right now and say fire, 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 fire. You're not going to go to jail. People are going to look at you a little weird, but you're not going to go to jail. Yelling fire in a crowded theater, Oliver Wendell Holmes said nothing about a crowded theater, just a theater. And his point was that if you cause, and by the way, this was something that happened in the early 1900s. Pranksters actually did this. And in one particular case, a prankster panicked people. They started a stampede. 23 people were injured, 6 people killed. It was a thing in the early goings of theater in the United States. But it's not about speech. There's nothing to do with your speech. It has to do with if you take actions that cause a stampede or you name it, you can be held responsible for your actions. But if you want to stand up in the town square and say you think that this race of people need to be sent to wherever, all Haitians need to go back to Haiti, you're perfectly allowed to say that. If you want to stand up and scream at the top of your lungs the N-word, you might lose your job because the First Amendment does not apply to your employer, but the government's not going to throw you in jail. If you wish to stand up and offer a soliloquy on the earth being flat, because you cannot see the curvature of the horizon. When you get in a plane, you fly from point A to point B. The world does not look round to you, even from the height of a plane. The world must be flat. There's no evidence. Even the pictures from space show a flat planet. You may be stupid, and you may be peddling misinformation, but it's perfectly legal. The American news media on a regular basis pushes misinformation and disinformation. They claim to be arbiters of truth, and oftentimes they're the ones who seed the lies. It's not against the law. If you hear someone saying you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to speech. Tim Walz, on a debate stage last night, uttered the line. What's so hilariously sad to me, though, are the number of progressives who are lawyers who rushed to defend him to say, yes, this is the case. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And so, yes, misinformation and hate speech are not protected under federal law. These people are clueless. They don't know what they're talking about. They're so busy trying to hump Tim Walz's leg. They themselves are the ones who are proverbially yelling fire in the crowded theater. They're the ones lying. They're the ones seeding misinformation and disinformation, and they can't even help themselves. At least know the truth, please. The phrase, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, does not even come from binding Supreme Court case law. It was a throwaway phrase by Oliver Wendell Holmes in a case in 1919 that the Supreme Court expressly overruled in 1969. And even when written in the case in 1919, it was not part of the legal decision. It was just an opinion offered by Oliver Wendell Holmes, and it was not meant to be you can't say it, but meant to be that if it were to spark a riot, you might be charged with sparking a riot, but you cannot actually be charged with yelling fire in a crowded theater. You're charged with starting a riot. Please be smarter than these legal commentators. And please, it's not hard to do. Please, I just beg you, be smarter than Tim Walz, who, God help us, at one point educated our children in public schools. Another reason to support school choice. Americans for Prosperity support school choice, and they'd love to have you on their team fighting for school choice around the country. They advance common sense conservative solutions to the problems that face us today, from securing the border to improving our schools with school choice. All you got to do is go to americansforprosperity.org/volunteer today. americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. You sign up with them. They can teach you how to be a door knocker, to teach you how to go door to door and help get people engaged in the electoral process. They can teach you how to go to your state government or local government and advocate for school choice and common sense conservative solutions for families and small businesses. They want you involved. They've got chapters in just about every state. You can be a part of yours, and if there's not a chapter there, you might be able to help them start one. If you're committed to conservatism and you want to advocate for it and advance it, go to americansforprosperity.org/volunteer today. Sign up with AFP. They're the nation's leading largest grassroots organization. They happen to be on our side. americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. Sign up with AFP today. Become an activist and a warrior for free markets and free people, for common sense conservative solutions.